सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen though.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
We are not saying that peace is broken out between India and China in eastern Ladakh. There is, however, some improvement. We cannot say peace has broken out at any time between India and China, because the last time we saw indications of a breakthrough which would be of strategic nature was when Deng Xiaoping and Rajiv Gandhi met. But even then, Deng Xiaoping did not say that we are settling the border. Deng Xiaoping said, he used, as usual, you can always find a Chinese saying or some old Chinese words of wisdom, or if they are not there, you can invent them and say they are ancient Chinese words of wisdom. So he said that maybe today's generation does not have the wisdom to resolve our border problem, an issue like this. So let's leave it to a wiser generation. That wiser generation in the case of China now is Xi Jinping, wiser generation like this. And if you look at that quote-unquote wiser generation of Xi Jinping, it doesn't look like Chinese are in a mood to have breakthrough peacemaking with any country. That said, that caveat out of the way, we have to see what's happening on the ground. And I don't like the Chinese expression, reading the tea leaves. So I'd rather look at evidence. I'd also rather look at information available from good sources, from official sources. On the Indian side, what we read in the well-informed, the better-informed international media, and also a little bit of strategic understanding of the situation, of the picture. So there is also a story by Snehesh Alex Philip, our defense editor, which I am sharing with you. You will have the link with you. Read that. I am drawing quite a bit from that story as well, and then giving you a larger picture. So what's been happening? What's been happening is, before I say that peace has broken out, definitely talks have broken out. Because the flurry of talks that we have seen between the military leaders of both sides, and these are tactical leaders, which means this is up to corps commander level. This is not the army chief level, right? That might be strategic. This is corps commander level, so tactical. So the commander on the Indian side, the Lieutenant General, who's commanding all the Indian troops and equipment on our side of the line of actual control, and similarly on the Chinese side. Usually the way the rank systems were, on the Indian side the corps commander is a Lieutenant General, on the Chinese side it's a Major General, because the Chinese have a more complex system, and also their battalion commanders are Lieutenant Colonels, whereas in the case of Indian Army, they are full colonels. So India has a Lieutenant Colonel who's like a second in command in a battalion, and a colonel who's the commandant. The Chinese, on the other hand, a lieutenant colonel who's a commandant. So these are different rank structures. So these talks started between the corps commanders. We keep hearing about these talks all the time. This was the 19th round since the standoff began, since the Chinese came in and sat on dharna along our eastern Ladakh frontiers, and then the clash in Galwan took place. It's been almost 3 years since this tamasha started. We know that some led to something, so there was de-escalation, or at least disengagement. The forces were disengaged and buffer zones were created in Galwan area, Gogra, Hot Springs, the Fingers area, in the Pangong Lake area, and again where the armor from two sides had come eyeball to eyeball or barrel to barrel, say in the Kailash range area. Their disengagement had taken place. So these corps commander level talks had made a difference in those areas. Last few corps commander level talks had not yielded anything besides platitudes, besides readouts. Both sides had anodyne readouts. The Chinese side had some subtle differences from the Indian side, but not very much. What's happened this time is different, and we know why it's likely to be different, or why it might be different, why it might be plausible for us to think that it's different. Because in the next 3 weeks, beginning tomorrow, there will be at least 2 occasions when Narendra Modi, our Prime Minister, and Xi Jinping, the Chinese strongman, the boss of everything in China, the boss of the country, the boss of the party, Communist Party of China, Chinese Communist Party, the boss of his army because he also heads the Chinese Military Commission, etc. So these two are going to be together at least on 2 occasions. Once, the first time at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg. At the time of recording of this episode of Cut The Clutter, we don't know if they will meet there, if there will be a bilateral meeting there or not, but they will be together on the same table. And second, then Xi Jinping comes to Delhi as a guest in the grand finale of India's year in G20, under India's G20 presidency. So that will be a big summit. So if you live in Delhi or thereabouts, remember 8th to 10th of September, it's avoidable to visit Delhi because a lot of Delhi is going to be sealed off. Now, we worry about 3 days of sealing off of large parts of Delhi. The fact is that the entire eastern Ladakh frontier has been sealed off by the two sides at an average altitude of 16,000 feet or above, right? It's been sealed off for almost 3 years now, and they've been clashes. So that entire frontier, that entire long frontier in eastern Ladakh has been sealed off with troops standing eyeball to eyeball on both sides for more than 3 years now. And that is where the two sides are trying to bring about a thaw or a calming down. So this corps commander level talks this time were slightly bit unusual because they went on for 2 days. Now the first day wasn't a full day of talks. It's not as if 2 full days of talks took place. The first day, that is on the 13th of August, the two sides met and they had dinner together. This meeting was on the Indian side in Chushul area, what is called as the Chushul Moldo area. Usually these talks, one round takes place on the Indian side, next round takes place on the Chinese side, so on and so forth. Indian side has a nice hut there, properly heated. I believe there is also a little volleyball court there because this is where senior commanders meet. So this meeting took place. The day before the substantive talks, the two sides met. The leaders or the commanders of the two sides met for dinner. Now that to meet for dinner before this, it's not as if you will meet for dinner and discuss football scores or cricket scores or stuff like that. You will talk about real stuff. But it also indicates that there's been a little calming in the relationship. So next day the talks went on the whole day. The readouts from the two sides suggested that there was some movement. At least the readout from both sides said that there were instructions or directives from the top leadership on both sides to tactical commanders to find ways to de-escalate the situation or disengage. There is in fact a distinction between disengagement and de-escalation, of which de-induction becomes a part, so 3 Ds, but I will come to that in a couple of minutes. So these meetings took place. After that, another 2 sets of meeting took place, which went on for 3 full days. 3 full days, and these were major general level talks. Now major general level talks are important because of the sectors that these involve. So one sector is what we in India call subsector north. That is headquartered at Daulat Beg Oldi. See on the map, that is the northern extremity, right? That's very sensitive for India. That's very sensitive for India because at the back of it lies Siachen Glacier. So this, if any loss of Daulat Beg Oldi and the area around it, there isn't that much flat ground for India to defend. But if India gets pushed back, then the underbelly of Siachen gets opened up. In front of Daulat Beg Oldi is the sprawling Depsang Plains. Depsang Plains are almost 900 square kilometers, and that is tankable terrain. I won't say flat terrain. There is no such thing as a totally flat terrain, but this is a high altitude desert and this is a very good tank terrain. So the Chinese worry that in case the Indian side gets a large tank force there, they can launch an assault and then try and cut off the Chinese Xinjiang highway, the Chinese Tibet-Xinjiang highway or Tibet-Xinjiang highway. The Chinese worry about that. So that's an area both sides worry about. So that is where one dispute lies, and that's the bigger dispute over Depsang Plains. And that is where the Indian delegation was headed by Major General P.K. Mishra, who's now commanding the 3rd Infantry Division, or what is called as the Trishul Division. And before I finish, I'll tell you a tiny personal story about this, but that is when we are done with the serious stuff. Now, one set of talks took place between the commander, the GOC of 3rd Infantry Division in Subsector North and his Chinese counterpart, Chinese PLA counterpart. Similarly, another Indian commander, that is Major General V. Hariharan. These are Major General level talks. He on the southern side of eastern Ladakh. That is where we have another dispute in an area called Demchok. Demchok is again something that's familiar to us right from 1962. Now, in Demchok, there is an issue around what is called as Charding Nala. There's a mountain stream. A lot of the stuff in the high mountains is done around either the ridges or the streams. Most of the patrolling, movement of troops, supplies, that happens in the valleys along the streams. So Charding Nala, across the Charding Nala from the Indian control side is a holy place, like a hot spring where local people of Ladakhi origin, they go and visit that as a holy place, the hot springs. The Chinese don't like it, and Chinese have been asking the Indian side for a long time to stop their people from going, but the explanation from the Indian side is these are traditional rites, people go there, how does it matter, we can't stop them. So the Chinese have come and pitched tents across the Nala on what India sees as its side. Now, India also in response has pitched their own tents facing the Chinese tents. So this is again an issue. It's not as complex an issue as say the Depsang issue is, but it's still an issue. And what the Depsang issue is, I'll explain to you in a couple of minutes. So at these two places, talks took place between the major generals of the two sides, major general level talks on two sides. And these talks went on for 3 days. That is 18th, 19th and 20th of August. Now, what do people at operational levels talk about for 3 days? So they exchanged notes, they came back, checked with their commanders, briefed their commanders, got further instructions and went back. And all of that has now led to a belief that the commanders at tactical levels are trying to find what might be called a workable solution. So de-escalate the situation through disengagement first. Disengagement is when troops are standing next to each other, as was the case say in Galban, Gogra, Hot Springs, the Finger area, Pangong Tso, Kailash range, when they are next to each other and anything can set off, even an accident can set off a clash or a misunderstanding can set off a clash, as was the case say in Galwan. You just get them to move some distance from each other and create buffer zones between them. Aap bhi idhar nahi aaoge, hum bhi nahi aayenge, will not come there, you will not come there. Now, of course, in the Indian debate, the critics of Modi government say that all the buffer zones have been created in the territory that India considered its own and that India earlier controlled. There are arguments and counter arguments. We are not going there because we also have no evidence. But the fact is that in many of these areas now buffer zones have been created, which is all for the good because this means chances of escalation are less. So that is disengagement. De-escalation on the other hand means the second D. De-escalation means that you restore status quo ante as it existed before say April of 2020. Which means that all the additional troops that you brought into these areas, all the additional formations that you brought into these areas, all the additional equipment, hundreds of tanks, literally hundreds of tanks on both sides, hundreds of armored personnel carriers, or what is these days preferably called infantry fighting vehicles because that's what they do. Maybe a couple of hundred of artillery pieces, heavy artillery pieces. All that bandobast has been made by both sides. Both sides have also moved in offensive air assets in these general operational regions. So de-escalation means beginning to take these back to where they used to be before this tension began or these clashes began in the shoving and fist fighting and leading up to deaths began in eastern Ladakh. So is that possible? We don't know. That is maybe in the long run. But for that to happen, first disengagement has to happen because then if the leaders of the two sides also decide that all right, disengagement has happened, now we have an understanding of where each side is and we are not going to violate this understanding. So we can de-escalate and send these people home, and that's where de-induction will take place. Now, to understand how different today's situation is from what the status quo ante was before April 2020. Until April 2020, India had only one division, then headquartered in Leh, the 3rd Infantry Division or the Trishul Division, watching this entire frontier. Now you have two divisions, but 2 divisions is an understatement, because in the middle you have large elements of India's strike corps. There are multiple brigades with tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, large elements of India's artillery, which have also come from India's strike corps, strike formations, and those are positioned in a flexible manner, but a lot of them you will find will be facing the Trishul region or maybe the Depsang region, because those are the regions where tankable terrain is available. We saw a lot of those in those videos that we saw spewing out smoke when Indian and Chinese armor were facing each other in the Kailash range area. So there are also these heavy elements. So I would say anything over the equivalent of 3.5 divisions of not just troops but also heavy equipment, strike elements, artillery, etc. So there is a lot of build-up. To take it all back will be a very important and very powerful call that both sides, if they take, that will mean a real breakthrough, and that will mean a strategic change. We are not there yet, but anything that leads up to that has to first begin with disengagement, and that's what's happening right now. And besides 3rd Infantry Division and these heavy strike elements, which are actually maybe more than a division strength, but heavy stuff, you also have another division strength formation called the Uniform Force. Now, Uniform Force, militaries have their own ways of naming their formation. So Uniform Force, you might remember from the episode of Cut The Clutter that we had done on increasing terror attacks or increasing terrorist activity in Rajouri Poonch forests, because we said that the military force, the military formation that was watching this area had been withdrawn and moved to Ladakh. That was called Uniform Force. That essentially then consisted of Rashtriya Rifles battalions, but that's been repurposed, re-equipped, etc., and it is now division strength, and it is watching the southern part of eastern Ladakh. So that is in a way a 2nd division, so 2 full divisions besides these strike elements. So it's like 3 divisions of troops are there. Now, what's the issue in Depsang? From what I understand, as yet, the issue in Demchok is not so big. It can be resolved. It has come up in the past like this. It's also been resolved like this. In Depsang, the issue is that Depsang actually is problematic and more complex. In 2002, because India and China started talks from 1988 onwards after Rajiv Deng meeting, and that's when the 2 sides also decided to freeze things, not to allow any clashes, etc., several rounds of border talks took place. So there was Brijesh Mishra, who was India's national security advisor in the Vajpayee era, with his Chinese counterpart. So they met several times. In one of those meetings, 2002, the 2 sides decided to exchange maps. The idea was that, look, you have a perception of where LAC is, we have a perception of where LAC is, so let's exchange our maps to understand who thinks where they are. So when the Chinese saw Indian maps, that is how I understand the situation, when the Chinese saw Indian maps, they balked immediately, because they said, look, in your maps in this area, in the Ladakh area, you've taken the entire expanse of Depsang plains, 900 square kilometers. You haven't done so in the past. And if that is the case, then this is not acceptable to us. So they refused to accept that. And then on, those talks then stopped. Those talks then did not move, because both sides discovered that the difference in perception between them was very wide, and it pertained to really important areas, particularly the Depsang plains. Other areas were not so important. Now, after that, since both sides had still kept things frozen, the Indian side kept on patrolling to certain points in Depsang Plains. Indian side was not going to the edge of India's claimed territory in Depsang Plains, claimed post 1962, claimed not in the sense of all of Aksai being a part of India, no, not that, but in the sense of where India believed the line of actual control was according to the maps that India has given to the Chinese in 2002. So India wasn't quite going there, India was stopping well short of that, but it was going to a series of patrolling points, patrolling point 10, 11, 11A, I'm going sort of west to east, right, a little bit north to south, so 10, 11, 11A, 12, 13. After 13 you come to patrolling point 14, which is Galwan. That is resolved. So India was going to these patrolling points. They were still stopping short of where India's claim line was, but they were quite far ahead of where Indian troops are positioned right now. The Chinese, on the other hand, had their own perceptions of the LAC. So they were also sending their troops ahead. So in a particularly critical area, their troops were coming across, both sides were sending their troops across a very narrow part of the mountains called bottleneck. Bottleneck as in bottleneck, right? So that is an area through which vehicles can't go. So India was sending patrols from there, and then from bottleneck they were coming out, reaching shortly afterwards a place called Y Junction. At Y Junction, as the name indicates, it divides into two. One side the route goes to patrolling point 10, the other side the route goes up to patrolling point 13, and these patrols used to go. The Chinese would come the same way, they will cross the bottleneck, they come to the other side of the bottleneck, and they actually claimed that their patrolling area or their claim line was deep inside, deep across that bottleneck point, stopping just 1.5 kilometers short of the big Indian headquarters where ITBP has a very large presence. That is the ITBP headquarters for that area, place called Birdsey. So they were stopping 1.5 kilometers of Birdsey camp. In 2013, India stopped the Chinese from coming to Birdsey camp. After that, Chinese had not yet stopped India from going to patrolling points that India had marked out. But once this standoff began, then the Chinese stopped Indian patrols also going from that side. Now, a lot of people will also say the Chinese have come and occupied Depsang Plains. They haven't done so. What they have done is that just facing Y Junction, in still territory controlled by them, they built in quick time, they built a 13-kilometer road from their base, and that 13-kilometer road they tarred, I believe, in less than 2 weeks. On that tarred road, watching the Y Junction, they've set up cameras, and those are high-resolution cameras and high-tech cameras which can detect movement. So anytime Indian troops cross the bottleneck area and go to that side, because they have to go on foot, vehicles can't go through bottleneck, the Chinese cameras or Chinese surveillance system relays it back to the Chinese commanders, and they send their troops in vehicles because they built a road, and Chinese troops then come in vehicles and stop the Indian patrols. As things stand, if India so wishes, India can get around the area, it can find other routes to reach these patrolling points, but that will then lead to clashes of the kind that took place in Galwan, and that's the reason India has not carried out these patrols. And at the same time, the Chinese also, they were not patrolling these areas so extensively. They were not coming next to Daulat Beg Oldi, for example, but they were coming up to Birdsey. That was stopped in the past. That is the issue right now in terms of what each side should do. So once again, to understand what goes on there, Y Junction, once you come to Y Junction, then one side this goes along what is called as Raki Nala to patrolling point 10. The other side, the other arm of the Y, then goes along what is called as Jivan Nala. I told you earlier that in the mountains you move along the streams and valleys. So the other side goes along Jivan Nala and reaches up to patrolling point 13. That is where Indian troops are stopped right now. So what are the objectives of these talks? Limited objectives. Number one, pullback of a certain number of troops and equipment if it's possible, right? Because it's not just Jawans or soldiers or patrols coming in each other's way, it's also what kind of heavy bandobast they have behind them. Number two, joint verification or survey of positions. So if you say, look, I am here, so joint verification, there is some evidence, and then acceptance, you are here and I am here, so we will not violate this. Number 3, and that is something that's been said now, and I think it's quite well established that this has happened, that both sides have agreed not to establish any new posts or any new positions. Next, both sides will now discuss and agree on new limits of patrolling and certain standard operating procedures before setting out on any patrolling, which means maybe informing the other side, etc., and so on. And since I told you earlier that I will tell you something about 3rd Infantry Division, 3rd Infantry Division, actually I owe a great deal to 3rd Infantry Division, or my family owes a great deal to 3rd Infantry Division, because when I first went to Ladakh as a member of what used to be called a press party in October 1980 with Darbara Singh, who was then Chief Minister of Punjab, and he was taking a cultural group to entertain the troops, so it taken a bunch of faltu journalists like us also. So I found, just walking around the division headquarters, I found a bunch of tiny little puppies, tiny little brown fox terrier, Ladakhi fox terrier puppies. And there was a Jawan who was a Malayali who was addressing them as, "Arey, Dilip Kumar kidhar ja raha hai? Arey, Nambiyar tum kidhar ja rahe ho? Arey, Rukmani kidhar ja rahi hai?" So I asked him, "Kya hai? And what kind of names are these and what pups are these?" And he said that our GOC, this is a litter that the GOC's dog has had. He has a small kennel. So I said, "Wow, can I take one of these?" So I particularly liked the one called Dilip Kumar. He said the GOC is very clear. He will not give any dog to anybody for free because he thinks people will then not take care. So I asked him, I thought maybe these are very expensive. So I said, "How much does a pup cost?" He said, 100 rupees. Now 100 rupees sounds like nothing these days, but I was then paid 650 rupees by way of salary. So 100 rupees was a lot. So I bought one of those pups and brought him along. And that was Mr. Misha. You see his picture, a bit fuzzy picture. He lasted with us almost for 13 years. And that's the reason I say that my family and I have a debt of gratitude to 3rd Infantry Div. Then headquartered in Leh.